I'm Angela Kelly Robeck, host of the Empowered Principal Podcast, a part of the Education Podcast Network, just like the show you're listening to now. Shows on the network are individually owned and opinions expressed may not reflect others. Find other education podcasts at edupodcastnetwork.com.
Welcome back to the HiTech Podcast. I always say welcome back because it's been a while since you've listened to us. I don't know, was it the last episode you just listened to a moment ago, or has it been weeks? No idea. But whenever you last listened, you're back, and we're very thankful.
The important part is they're back.
Me, William Illingworth, one of your two co-hosts, and you just heard, who's that?
Bill? Josh? I don't know.
Is that Bill Schwartz?
That's, no, not correct at all. Yeah,
Folks,
Josh, I'm the co-host.
If you've never noticed, right, I take this very seriously, but if you've never noticed, Josh's last name is Schwartz. There's no schwa in there. It's a very common thing for folks to give him a Schwartz.
W-A-R-T-Z, and then here is my social security number. It is.
And he lives at... No, we're back, folks. This is episode 113. Wow, it's actually going to be a lucky episode, even though 13 is a bad luck number for some folks. We have joining us this week Steve Martinez of the Cami app. Now, this is one of many situations where I met someone on Twitter.
I feel like we need a sticker for you. Like, there should be a shirt that you wear and you get a sticker each time it happens. Like I met
Badges.
someone. Yeah. Like it's just Ted Lasso with like you met a cool person. Yes! Like, you know what I mean? And you get it all over your shirt. I like this idea.
Your networking ninja hashtag is, at work. Steve knew nothing about him, and now we want to be best friends with him. Yes, we've already recorded the intro.
Yeah. We are best friends. Steve
We're
and I,
best friends.
Yeah, he's already been here. He flew over after the episode was over.
We're very excited for you to listen to this conversation because, frankly, we started out with an easy topic. We just said, hey, what's flipped classrooms like? And it's not an easy topic.
And then he was like, you flipped the desks. Ba-doom.
Spoiler alert.
Nailed it.
But with the powerful beard that he brings to this conversation, you will be enraptured by his story because, frankly, I love people who become... No. This is not the way to put it.
No, you hate people who become something?
I love people who are educators and then find out how to educate, quote unquote. No, like Steve demonstrated in his story, he is a fantastic and heart-bound, mission-driven educator. And then he went and got a master's degree in it. And then he went into the classroom. Like he was already doing para-education stuff and he ended up in the classroom. I'm very excited for you to hear how this story plays out because it's how my story went in some ways. Like I wasn't trying to be an educator. I just love doing this stuff and being involved in it. And it's just so exciting to hear how his story comes together because as he's doing his work, if you're familiar with the theory and the why, the research behind these techniques, you're going to be like, yeah, of course he did that. Of course he did that. Oh, duh. Yeah, I should try that too. If you're not familiar, Steve is literally following the playbook and he didn't even know it, right? He was writing the playbook as he went. So I don't know. You got anything else? I'm already
I feel like if I say anything else, it's just basically us repeating what the interview will be. Like that's
That's fair. All right, folks, let's turn it over. In just a second here, you'll be hearing from us and Steve. Okay, folks, usually when we're starting up with a new guest, I spend a lot more time on the guest, but I just have to call it out real quick. My EdTech Life podcast getting a cameo in this episode. Thank you, Steve, for bringing the Fonz to us. We love that. My EdTech Life is hosted by Fonz Alfonso. He is a part of the Education Podcast Network, which you hear at the beginning of every single one of these episodes, so we're very excited to have that rep here. But besides, a wonderful hat. How you doing today, Steve?
Great. Thanks, Will. Thanks, Josh, for having me. Super pumped for an enlightened conversation.
Whew, that's asking for a lot. I hope we get there.
Setting a lot of standards, man. Like,
we hope we get there, my friend. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Let's set the stage. So, you're working for Cami now. Wonderful T-shirt, love it. But you were a teacher for quite some time. So, what was that transition like for you? How many years were you a teacher? All that.
Yeah. So I was a social studies teacher for 4 years.
Yes.
And for 14 years before that, I was in the music education space.
Awesome.
wow.
So which involved working with kids for sure, but also doing a lot of writing and designing, working with parents, band directors, really
Wow.
like a crazy spectrum of stakeholders now that I think back on that time.
Yeah.
And I did it started really young, but then got to the point where I was like, wait a second, I'm basically teaching. I was going into classrooms, I was going into football fields, I was had my own like pedagogy before I even knew what that word was.
Yep.
And what it
Yep.
meant, right? Like I had classroom management before I even was experienced to that kind of language. And so got my credential, got into the social studies space, and really because of my background, like leaning into the technology seems so natural. Like
Yes.
working with music
Okay.
software, with drill
Yeah.
software, stuff like that. It just made sense, and it made sense to me of like, well, you utilize all this technology for good and to solve real problems that teachers experience in the classroom. And so spending 4 years in that social studies classroom, I did a lot of work in graduate school, but also like, your typical certifications of,
Right. Right.
your MIEs. I'm an MIE expert, right, on the Microsoft
Yep.
side.
Yep. Hashtag.
Okay. Yeah.
Hashtag, yeah. I also, I also leaned into obviously Cami, and Cami
Okay.
was just a company that they just had this welcoming vibe, this
Yeah.
openness of like, Steve, we want to hear your feedback, we want to collaborate with you. I eventually ended up being a Cami hero, which is a part of their ambassador program.
Yep.
Okay.
Which was, like you as a teacher, you're like, oh, I'm a part of this prestigious group, like this.
I'm in.
Yeah.
I'm in, yeah.
I'm
called you
part
a
of the cool
hero,
crowd.
right?
And they
You
call
know,
me a
like-
hero. No teacher gets called a hero. And so from there, they invited me at the time. So this is right during the time where we hit the pandemic, and Cami was offering up this virtual conference, and called Cami
Okay.
Connect. The first one I attended, I was just a participant, but the second one and the third one, they asked me to speak. And
Oh, wow.
right, that was my first Cami Connect. Was the first time I've ever presented to teachers, which was crazy
Oh.
because it was
Oh.
kind of a big audience. It wasn't like this
Yeah.
little
Right.
local thing.
Right. Right. Right.
Yeah.
And my first one was on blended learning, and I just immediately felt like, as much as I love students and I love connecting with students, like there's just like this broader audience of these lifelong learners that I felt I could make an impact in very different ways, but maybe even more meaningful by trying to touch a wider spectrum of education.
Right.
And so building that rapport with Cami, and they also have a podcast of their own, Teacher podcast.
Oh, that's
if
awesome.
you want to
Okay.
check that out.
Yeah,
I was
writing
also
it down.
Write that down, man. Yeah, it's a good little show. I was on there talking project-based learning.
Okay.
Had a good time with that. So it was like all these things that fell into place,
Right.
and it eventually led to being at Q, which is a big conference we have in California.
Okay.
Seeing Cami in person, a lot of their workers and stuff, and just like connecting with them there. And I won't say who it is, but someone nudged me, like, at Q, and it was like, Steve, come on.
What are you doing?
And, what are you doing? And it wasn't anything pushy. It was just like, would you ever leave the classroom? And my initial answer was like, no, because I loved using technology and pedagogy in innovative ways to give students experiences that, frankly, they don't always get, at least at my school, at least in my district.
Right.
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 Yeah.
And because I wasn't a stand and deliver guy, right? Like I wasn't like passive learning. It was like, how do we?
I don't know. You strike me as pretty dry, just like that straight laced
Yeah.
front of the room kind of guy. That's what I'm getting. That's the
Yeah.
vibes.
When I looked, the first thought I saw when I looked at you was like, yeah, he's a podium guy. He's totally behind the podium.
Oh yeah, with the suit. Yeah. But yeah, so like that. So just to answer your question, that's kind of my journey. Maybe a little long-winded, but that's kind of my journey
perfect.
of like
That's perfect.
how I started and then how I eventually ended up with a company like Cami.
I love it.
That's awesome.
Now, in the process of that, like I'm hearing you saying project-based learning, you're coming out of the band stuff, so you learned the pedagogy after expressing. I'll say that after expressing pedagogy, right? You were already teaching, you're already doing the work, but then you learned maybe through master's degrees, other things like that about like the technical terms and things like that. What introduced you to the idea of like a flipped classroom? Was that something you stumbled across, or you were already doing it and then found the name for it?
Yeah.
It was kind of interesting because I come across it even as a college student. Because even as a college student, we were doing during that time when I was in college, they weren't doing flipped, but they were doing hybrid, right? Where like these universities are like, hey, let's cut costs by not having the students show up all the time, right?
No, they never do that.
They don't cut
never
money.
do that. And so, but then when I started teaching, I did read a few things, seen a couple things like on Twitter, and these people, a few individuals using this term called flip, and initially I was like, okay, if I'm able to leverage the class time differently, I can really move past a lot of my frustrations that I had going through the credential program, seeing my cooperating teacher teach, and bless her heart, like she's an amazing teacher. She was that stand and deliver, and she's a gifted lecturer, but I was not. So I'm like, how do I move past that? And then also this whole idea of students taking notes, like the old school way, right? Of like, they're either listening to you or they're not documenting their learning.
Yeah.
Right.
Or they're doing it's, and then it's the other way around. And it's like, so there was just something about it. I'm like, my students were performing decently. Like you have like average kind of scores, right? Like if you look at like the whole average of your class, but I was like, that's not, for me, that wasn't good enough. I'm like, how do we do this better? Or at the very least, how do I do this better? So initially with the flipped classroom, I was like, look, if I can get them doing the initial learning outside of the room, now I have a full 50 minutes for engagement, for creativity, for teaching. At the time, we used to say soft skills, but now I'm like, man, these are so critical now. Like now that we're out of the pandemic and seeing where the workforce is going, where, the involvement of AI, like all these things, it's so important that students know how to communicate, collaborate, know how to get on a computer and do those, word processing, all that stuff. But how are we supposed to do that if you're quite literally pushing new information to them at least 35, 40 minutes out of each period? It's impossible. I think it's impossible.
And some of the science shows that they're only going to get maybe 20% of that anyways. Yeah. Right. So you've just wasted. Yeah. Correct. Yeah. Preaching to the choir.
Yeah. So that was initially how I got into it. And when I first started, I'll be honest, I was kind of blind. I was like, I didn't do any of the research. I was like, hey guys, we're just going to do some videos. Let's just try it out. But the big success, even with me doing it like super rookie at it, all of my seniors, all their test scores went up exponentially within 2 weeks. And that was just me just like, hey, we're trying something. So I was like, wait, there's something to this. Shortly after that moment, I started working on my master's in curriculum and instruction. And my thesis was on flipped classroom. So then doing the deep dive on it, I'm like, oh, whoa, there's so much more to this than just having students do some videos outside of the class. Like there's a wide range of benefits and nuances that are a part of a successful flipped classroom.
Yeah. Ironically, I've always seen the flipped classroom as like getting students to internships faster. Yeah, you know what I mean? Like how I did my internships, right? Like we got in a room once a week, we did a little debrief, and it's like, okay, make sure you try this week. And you went out and you went and did it in your internship. Like, it's not fully that, but it's as close to that, for my opinion, as you can be in the structured K-12 education system where they have to be in your classroom. Well, all right, if I have to have them here, well, then let's do something. Let's practice what we're trying to get them to learn.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it just seemed to, when I was first introduced to the idea, I remember thinking the same thing. First being like, okay, like, do we just like flip the furniture upside down? Like I was in college too, and I was first introduced to the idea, and I was like, so what? We just, okay, cool, flip it, got it.
We sit on our heads now.
Yeah, but the idea of just using that time with students better was really my first takeaway. It was like, okay, this seems like more of trying to say, getting them prepared for time to come together and not wasting it just trying to slam information at them that all the science says they're not going to remember all of it. That was always my favorite part. Like when you're getting used to like teaching or communicating to people, they'd be like, here's how you do it. You lay out these things, and then they're probably going to remember 20% of that. And I remember thinking early on in college being like, wouldn't that be like a failure in in school? Like 20% feels like I failed. Like, shouldn't we do that differently then if that's not the case? Now, I'm curious, Steve, for those listening who are maybe less familiar with Flipped, or like they've heard of it, but they haven't necessarily done it. So I know you mentioned some videos and stuff, but what did it actually look like for you when you started implementing Flipped? Like, what was some of the stuff that you changed about both what you gave them outside of the classroom and then also like what you were doing inside the classroom with them? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So let's start with I guess the videos themselves.
Yeah.
So that's a lot. So I was the only one on my school site of like 100 teachers that was flipping, like full on flip. And this is before the pandemic. So I've read a lot of like, success stories that this was not me, but like, hey, if you're gonna flip, do it with a teacher buddy. Like, hey, how about if my homie next door can make like half of the videos and then I'll make the other half and we collab, like teacher collaboration. Imagine that.
Yeah.
But I built all of my stuff by myself, which it took me.
Oh man,
it took me a hot minute, right? But
AKA you didn't sleep for the school year.
Yeah.
And I did, yeah. So when I first did it, I did it mid-year, starting with spring economics.
Okay.
So I did the whole build that with just economics. Like,
okay.
So I didn't
light
flip,
topic.
Yeah. I didn't flip everything all at once, and I didn't build everything all at once.
Okay.
So I actually started flipping with my older students first. And then was like, okay, then I'll get to world history, which building the content there, that was much more challenging than doing it for economics and government like that. But so there was the video component of it. Then I got smarter and like, okay, we talk about how to be more engaging in the classroom as teachers. I'm like, it's time for me to level up like some of my software and how do I make it more engaging with the video stuff. So there was a app or a tool that I got familiar with. It's called I don't know if yeah.
We just saw it at ISTE.
That thing is hot. Like that thing is like the stuff you can do in that, and then all that stuff got anyone from Cammy's listening. That stuff used to get paired with Cammy, but like it's super hot in terms of like how you can get like students to be like, whoa, Martinez, this is like professional stuff. I'm like, thank you, bro.
I got you.
But yeah, I got you. But yeah, so like leveling that stuff up there, but also less is more. And so I would not make a video longer than like 10 minutes, 15 minutes the max. And looking at the micro teaching of it, I'm like, you know what, tonight, students, we're really just going to learn about demand. That's it. And then we're going to really do the assessment piece in class, that formative, low stakes, taking analytics, right? Seeing who knows what before they even enter the room, right? And
if I could pause here, Steve, and just like say to any of current faculty that I'm working with who happen to listen to our podcast, I know there's a couple of them. If you're listening, just listen to what Steve's saying right now and replicate. That's all I want. That's all I want. 10-minute videos.
But you're also
the analytics before they come in. This is I love this. This is fantastic.
What's amazing to me hearing your story here, Steve, is that you're doing this while you're researching some, but you're in that time, right? You're doing this because it's what sounds good. You're getting it a try. Like as you're writing this stuff down, you're talking like, oh, I tried this. I was like, yep, that's the theory. Yep, that's the science. Yeah, I'm like, it's checking the boxes of everything that I studied in my master's degree, right?
Right.
But you're doing this like just because it felt right. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know. Like you're just like stepping in.
Yeah. And so with students, some of the challenge sometimes was that buy-in. You're like, oh, we got homework. I'm like, that 10-minute video is all the homework you have. Like, really, if you think about it, like you have all the class time now to work on whatever project, whatever essay, whatever. And so that kind of takes us, because I know like, Will, like your original question was like, okay, how did you build this outside and inside? It did change how I handled that in-class time. And first, it was rough because I was like, wait, I used to just talk at them for 40 minutes. The heck do I do now? And so it was like, wait a second, I have all this extra time. All right, cool. So let's think different about this and how to. But then that actually what's interesting. Then going back to the beginning here is that went back to like when I was teaching drumlines. I was like, wait, how do we leverage all of that time? It's a lot of repetition. It's a lot of hey, you already know how to play a role, but how do we take it to the next level by doing some think, pair, shares, some buddy system, some cooperative learning, right? Some jigsaw method. And I started compiling a laundry list of now all the extra stuff that I get to do in the classroom, and then think about doing and teaching things outside of my curriculum even. Like, yes, they learn the history, they learn the civics, but they started learning like, wait, we can learn entrepreneurship. We can learn about branding and marketing. We can do cross-curricular instruction with other teacher friends, right? It just opens up all these doors of what you can do inside the classroom. And one good example that I have, I think, is everyone hears this term station rotation. Now, this was back then. They're the station rotation term. And I remember when I was a substitute teacher, I'm like, oh, that's like an elementary thing. And I was like, wait a second, this could be really cool at the high school level. Because at the high school level, like if they're curating different things or taking whatever they learned the night before in the video and applying it and differentiating and customizing and personalizing for our learners built around these stations.
Yes.
That is where you're meeting students where they're at. And it's, for me, one of the more like equitable things I did in the classroom.
I love that. I just love the view of how much it opens up the classroom time for other things. Like you said, basically, like you start to realize if I don't have to communicate all this information in this mini period of time, but I'm able to push it out into a different space, not overload them, but push it out into these digestible clips, these things that they can look at, come into the class prepared. It opens up all the doors for you to bring on all these different types of practices that are getting them to actively engage with what they were hearing and learning, to both try to pull it back from memory, both try to apply it to things, think about it in different ways, engage with each other around it. I have to say, Steve, I love your drumline example. So I'm a drummer myself as well. And the second you said that, I remember that as well. Like I remember I was not in drumline. I started too late and got too into rock music and jazz music, but I remember having a jazz teacher, and that was like his thing was like, you're going to watch these videos of guys doing this. You're going to get the basics of the techniques. And then we'd come in with other students and you'd essentially like go off of each other and play with each other. You'd also work off of each other, view each other, give feedback. And he'd be walking around kind of like this ominous jazz teacher, looking at your looking at how your hand positions were. And he always got me for being too much of a punk drummer. But that piece though was that I got to kind of introduce to the idea, start to maybe mess around with it myself, looking at the instruction, and then being able to get feedback and engage with it in new ways and see how other people were playing it and how they were trying to do it, and actually talking with them about how they're trying to do the positions or the beats or like what they do with their hands to do stuff, to see them or see how somebody else is playing it. And I think that example fits perfectly with any content to like you're showing in economics to world history. You're getting to engage with that content then with other people in different ways and coordinated activities and all that stuff to start to process and mold more understanding of what they engaged with the night before or whatever timing that video was before the class. That, and we know from looking at how people learn that type of flow is needed for people to understand things. So I love that whole flow of it.
And that's super. I'm sorry. Like that's why one little like follow up with that is what's interesting is my students would tell me, Martinez, your class is crazy hard. And they would tell me like I would have students legit, like they were AP students, but they didn't take AP their senior year. They're like, your class is legit harder than AP. And I was like, no way, that cannot be possible. They're like, well, no, but it has nothing to do with the workload. Like AP workload, that's nuts. Your class is harder because we have to think so hard.
Oh no.
But they've never, they just get conditioned of like just memorizing a ton of stuff and then spilling it out in like this little moment of time, whether it's on a test or an essay or whatever. But with the way it is with the flipped and how they have to come in and really apply, look at Bloom's, right? Like really apply, and then layer in the project-based learning, like on top of that, like it was really solving a lot of problems simultaneously. But my question to them always was, but is it good for you? And even when they didn't want to, they'd be like, yes. Yes.
That is back to back there. Those are the greatest compliments you can get as a teacher, right? Like, is it good for you? And them answering yes, but also that point of like, why is it hard? Because you make us think. Like, dude, I want to give you a gold. I want to give you anything I can, a trophy, a gold star, a something. Like, that's just amazing. I love that. I was thinking through like what you said about the laundry list. Like you had to stop at a moment, and so you make this radical change. Suddenly your classroom is significantly different. The classroom management issues are about to go through the roof, and you're stepping there for a second like, what do I do? And you said you made a laundry list of the types of things you could now use your classroom time for. That cued for me this thought of like, wait a second. 9 out of 10 teachers then are standing in their room doing one thing for the entire time. Like if that's what we're doing for a majority of instruction styles, direct instruction styles, right? You are doing one thing to teach them every day, the same style of teaching over and over and over again. You're saying like, dude, I got 24 things I could do with these kids today. Which one am I going to pick? And taking that approach to saying, this might work better for these students. This might work. That's differentiated instruction, right? But that rotation of it is going to challenge all of them at different times. Direct instruction is going to work for the person like me who just kind of keeps it in his head, and is going to work for the student who can like take good notes, and then it's not going to work for everybody else. Like that's your split up. You're going to lose 33% of your students, and the other 66, like they're going to have hit and miss too. Whereas you've got these like just a laundry list of opportunities to put your students up against to help them learn in different ways and new ways. To me, that's like, there's research on flipped classroom, it's proving effectiveness. There's ways you're saying, even with your students, their end scores were great, but that's it for me. Like, we can teach them in more ways. We can do more with them than just lecturing, than just the traditional direct instruction method. Why didn't we do this episode sooner, Josh?
Because we needed Steve here. We've been waiting for Steve.
Thank you,
he's
Steve.
Arrived. That's the real answer. Steve, I'm curious. So I'm just very curious by your walk into this, right? Because it's very interesting jumping into it, not having a lot of the research and information about it before. Kudos to the way you approached it. Like, you sounded like you did in approaching it, but I'm curious. I know you said then you, through degrees and stuff, are getting more information about the actual and doing research on it. how did that cause you to tweak the way that you did any of the stuff in there? Like once you started to get some more of that information, seeing that, okay,
Or year two.
Year two, or all other people are doing this or this, what did you maybe tweak about how you did it? Was there something maybe you brought in for how you did stuff outside of class or in class that you maybe changed, that you were like, oh, this really worked well, or I loved this?
Yeah, so going back to, so we talked about how we made my videos more engaging, but I was just speaking maybe from an aesthetic standpoint, right? Like using software and all that stuff. The other thing I added to that is using various tech tools to gather analytics while students were watching the video. And teachers out there, you probably already know what that tool is for you, and there's so many of them now. And so let's say Cami, for example, like there's a video on a doc, they take notes, but now Cami now has a question tool. So if you're able, whether it's Cami or any other tool, pose those checking for understandings throughout a video, and some of them, like the video stops, right? And then there's a question, you answer it. And if you can find a tool that collects all of those analytics for you, not only is that touches the basis of like your assessment, right? That formative checking for understanding, but it's really telling for a teacher when they look at the analytics and like, hey, how come all of my students really struggle with this part of the video or with this question? And then talk about going back to differentiation, now I can go into first period struggle with this question. So we're going to head on tackle that thing with this group of students or small group of students. And then with second period, they rocked it. And so, but they didn't rock the end of the video. So let's tackle that.
Right.
So now you're looking at customizing across all of your classes for all of your students. And so really collecting the analytics and using technology as your ally to do that was something that I eventually added while doing all that research, while looking at other struggles that other people have written on, and really using all of that information to give me the tools and the data that I need to drive my decisions in a classroom. And I think that I would always start the day, like the students would come in, there'd be some sort of bell ringer, which was always different per class period because it would be the thing that they struggle with the most. We talk about it, and we would then do I would call it a check-in quiz, and I would use like Cami or whatever tool I had up that day, and they would then take a quiz, but they would take it, and then we would go back and correct each one. Yes. And so when I would correct each one, students would be like, oh, I understand that now. Or I kind of got that in the video, but now I get it here because Martinez is actually in the room with me. So again, what works for one will not work for the other. And I did recognize that. And my videos weren't perfect, right? Like, and I recognize that. But at the end of that check-in quiz, I always had students do a self-reflection. Like, how did it go? What did you struggle with? And if you were to do this again, what maybe study practices, what kind of norms would you establish? Like that self-monitoring. And the big thing I would ask that I knew a lot of my colleagues wouldn't always do, because it is scary, I would ask them, give me feedback. I want your feedback on how was the video? Did I deliver stuff clearly? Was it engaging? Did the questions really tailor to the check-in quiz that you experience in class? And I would read all that feedback. And then, so here's the other benefit of that, is this power struggle from a classroom management perspective, this I'm your teacher, you're my students, that wall would just virtually not even be there.
Wow.
Because they felt, and they give me this feedback where they're like, you're just another member of our classroom community. Like, you're just a part of the group, you're a part of the team. And there was a level of trust there that really
Right.
went a long ways for when I did want to try something new, or when I did need to push them, whether it's academically or maybe
Yeah.
with this, that, or the other different things that they were struggling with, right? And that whole this whole language we would hear during the pandemic of like, we have to build relationships, like healthy relationships, rapport with students. I felt like a lot of times that was lip service, because it was never really clearly articulated to me, like, well, how do you do that then? Like, if you're an administrator telling that to your staff, like, how
What
are
are
you
the
doing
steps?
that? I kind of stumbled into the how
Yeah.
without even knowing it. I'm like, wait, this is how.
Yep.
The flip learning fostered that environment for me to do that. And there was other choices and research that went behind that.
Right.
But I just got really lucky that I was able to build that healthy rapport with my students, with Flip being there for me, and again providing that atmosphere to do so.
That's
love it.
awesome. I love that. I love your point about the relationship aspect. Like, and it's funny because we talk about it and we hear that all the time, and I laugh when you say you feel like it was lip service, because I was like, what? Humans say we should build relationships, but we don't actually mean it. It just sounds fun.
It's the thing to do.
It's the thing to do. Yeah. But the part of it that you did it's at the end of the day not that complicated, is talking to the students, giving them a chance to speak into what's happening. You want to build relationship. It doesn't happen through crappy questions of acting like you care about the students, or gimmicky things that you do with relationships with students. At the end of the day, it starts with showing that you actually want to hear from the students what they think, and honoring that in that way. And I think that's what you saw happen there, right? Is when you start to do that breaks down that barrier. Will and I were just talking about this a couple episodes ago. I don't remember what it was, but talking about how just building that rapport with students, I know there's pushback in other areas from people who act like that's like, well, we're not here just to give the students whatever they want, or, I'm not here to babysit the students, especially Will and I see that a lot in higher ed, where it's like, we're not here to, I can't think of the word right now.
I'm here to deliver the instruction. It's up to them to take the instruction.
They're here for me. But basically that idea, but the point of just how much payoff having rapport with your students does, right? Being able to speak into their lives in ways that is earned through relationship in there. And no matter what you want, you can be the most authoritative person ever. If you don't have that relationship, the impact's just not going to be there. Like, I know we were talking about professors or teachers that we would go over the moon for to do or work hard in that class. I remember working hard in classes that I could have cared less about the topic, but it was because that teacher respected me and I had a good relationship with that teacher. And because of that, I wanted to engage in that class. I wanted to engage in those areas. So I think that's a cool component of this in the flipped classroom, is trying to figure out how to build those relationships.
Yeah. And like what I used to hear often is like teachers would be like, oh, these kids they're not the way they used to be. These kids are different. I'm like, yes, they are. and rightfully so, because like, think about what this generation has gone through just in the last 5 years, right? Like learning at home, like all that stuff. And kids are going to change and they're going to continue to change. But my question is, how are we changing as educators to make sure that they get everything they need to thrive throughout their lives?
Yeah. Oh, that's
I
a good
love
question. And it's a good statement. Yeah.
That's clip worthy right there, my friend. Like, it's just like, all right. Respecting time. We typically have folks talk about something they want to, some app or something they've used before. They're interested in.
I wonder what he'll pick.
I wonder if you have any apps in mind. No. So really though, I've not used Cami. I only heard about it. I think like bumping into you through Twitter. Like, I had not been familiar with this tool. So if you'd like to talk about Cami, give us a little insight into what it is, what it does, I'd love that.
Yeah, sure. So I think when people first come across Cami, they're like, oh, it's a digital annotation tool.
Okay.
It's like Adobe. And no shade. no shade to any like Adobe person out there or anything like that. But I just think that the two things are very different. The way that for teachers out there that they're like, oh, like I don't know what Kami is at all. What I tell them is like Kami can quite literally be the entire ecosystem of what you would need in your classroom. Like, so like you need
Love it.
video stuff. Kami has that. You need to provide more efficient, but also high quality feedback. Kami has that. Collecting analytics and assessment. Kami now has that. And the ability to have an app with high level of accessibility where now it's not about writing out an essay anymore. You can write out that essay. You can do it on paper still, but you can put it in a Kami doc. And now I can use voice comments. Students can reply using voice comments, text to speech, speech to text. You can use it for a collaborative experience with students for ideating and brainstorming. And so to me, it goes beyond just a digital annotation tool. Because of all the accessibility, we now support more languages. The built-in dictionary, right? Like all these things that were really meant to support all learners in a classroom. And I think one of the things that Kami is really proud of is how we integrate into all the learning management systems, and how like it's like a one-stop shop. And because let's get real, like it's super hard training students sometimes. Like, oh, you have to go to this tool for this video thing, or you have to go to this other tool for this. Been
saying
thing.
It my entire life.
And it's facts.
Right.
And the thing with it though is that now we can house all of those different type of items that you may need in the classroom. We house it into one app versus all these other apps. And the fact that it's integrated into, like, let's say a Google Classroom, game over in terms of making clarity in the classroom, but still being able to deliver content and have students deliver that content back to you in meaningful and equitable ways.
I'm just looking at like the lead screenshot on kamiapp.com, and I've got text, I've got highlighting, I've got drawings, I've got comments. So we're talking like, Google comments or whatever, like the classic collaborative comments we expect these days. I see voice, I see video, I see collaborators. I see, it's like, it's actually a very simple image when you look at it at first, and then you start trying to take down all the stuff they got in there. I'm like, is it a Swiss Army knife? It's a Swiss Army knife. It's the Swiss Army knife of EdTech.
It is. And I think Fonz uses that term for Kami.
Of course.
Really?
Of course he does.
Uses a Swiss Army. I'm pretty sure he uses that when he speaks. And by the way, Fonz is a Kami hero. If you're not aware.
I love it.
Yeah.
I love it. He's gonna get tagged in this episode. I'm gonna send it to him directly. We're gonna get on Fonz's show.
I don't remember being on the HiTech podcast. Why am I mentioned so often in this episode? Steve, real quick, I want to make sure I want to highlight something I think you mentioned when you were talking about how you used it in Flip. Did I hear right that they also even have, like, you can add questions into videos in Kami? Did you mention that, or was that something tied differently?
Yes. So it almost. So
okay.
You can we have a tool called Kami Questions, which are really building an embedded question onto the Kami doc, not into the video itself.
Oh, okay. Yeah. That's cool.
But you can use it. You can use those question types in that way, though.
Absolutely.
If you're trying to collect analytics that way. So think about, like, the way I explain questions is like, imagine you have Google Form, like we've been using for quite some time for assessments. But if you had all of Kami accessibility on top of that.
Yeah.
So like the way that we assess students now, we make it more equitable, and then we can better have students demonstrate their learning by, let's say, they can do a screencast, what we call a screen capture comment, to show all the steps in a video.
Straight in Kami.
Like all this is straight up in Kami.
Woo! Why? Oh, man, I'm like learning a whole bunch of stuff during this episode. One, we should have brought you on earlier. This connection should have happened much sooner. Two, I need to go open this app like immediately. I love the idea of all of that stuff being in a ecosystem for people to access, like, because that's one of my biggest frustrations. And while Will and I love all the different apps and things that we look at, it's always difficult when you're trying to do all these things with students and trying to bring everything into a singular place. They usually, you just don't find that experience in a lot of different apps of trying to bring a lot of, it just sounds like it has a lot of cool stuff that comes together in one area that could be very utilized well with students.
Yeah, and that's why my team, the teacher success team, that's why we're here, right?
Yeah.
So we offer up that professional learning, that professional development, all free. Like, whoever wants to learn about Cami can book us and just learn. And so and to me, it's not just always about the app. So I'll do a flipped classroom session, but it's a Cami flipped classroom session, right?
Right.
And for me, it's putting the teaching first and be like, okay, here's this tool we have.
By the way,
that serves as an ally. But like, teachers appreciate that though, right? Like, we're not that typical vendor of like, hey, here's how to use every single tool. We're meeting teachers just like I did with students. We're meeting teachers where they're at by really, what are your pains? What do you want to get better at? What do you want to thrive at? And being that coach, that guide on the side, helping them along not just their Cami journey, but their journey as an educator.
Yeah.
Golf clap. I mean, just I'll do it on screen. There we go. Yeah. That's fantastic. Steve, we have kept you too long. Thank you so much for this wonderful story about the flipped classroom background, but everything here about Cami. You've enlightened us. We hope to enlighten our audience as well. And this is not a closed door. Glad to have you back. Or if you got other Cami-ites, is there a term? Are you Camits? Camis? What are you?
They
what
just
are
be
you?
Cami heroes? Isn't that a thing they already termed?
No, well, so like it's internally, we're chameleons.
Yeah, if you and any other chameleons want to come fade into our background,
that was much better than whatever Will and I just came up with. So.
They came up with it, not me.
I love it. All right, thank you so much. We're Josh and I are going to do a little debrief here in a little bit, but it's been such a pleasure to have you. Thank you again, my friend.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Whew, buddy. Okay. Like, this is...
Now that you've seen the beard, you know that his beard is powerful. It's literally Josh's beard.
There's so much that, like, I didn't know that, like, other soulmates could be found. You know? Like...
You know, Sam doesn't usually listen to the end of the episode, so she'll never hear this.
And she's behind on the podcast too, so she'll never get to that point. No, like I love this because like
you just met your alter ego, right?
I did, yeah. Except cooler because he didn't say this in the podcast, but he's been to Hobbiton. Yes. Like what the crap? No, so what I loved about this episode, beyond just Steve is amazing, is that flipped classroom for me was like the first educational principle or like educational pedagogical thing that I knew before I even knew what pedagogy was and how that all applied and things like that. I felt like that was one of those things that was introduced to pretty early on in college, and of course the teacher who introduced it and started doing it explained what it was, and I learned what that concept was. And it started, I think, I don't know when it really got popular, Will, but I feel like during our times in school, it started to grow in popularity a bit. Would that be fair to say?
I think it's fair to say probably the last 10 years, the technology has made it practical.
It's made it more accessible.
It didn't used to be very easy to do a flipped classroom. Like how did you have your students do stuff outside of the classroom that you usually taught them in the classroom?
Well, before the internet, it was smoke signals. Like, so you smoke signaled the video content, and then you had them come back. They had them come back in.
That's a lot.
Just
that's
some
good.
thoughts. But anyway, so it was one of those first things I learned about, and ironically, Will and I have never talked about it on the podcast, and so it's been interesting to hear Steve talk about. What I really appreciated with Steve is that he didn't have that background beforehand in flipped classroom.
Right.
And yet,
Right.
like, he textbook implemented flipped classroom. Like, if one could write a textbook on
If
how to do
someone
flipped
told
classrooms,
you-
it would be what Steve did. Like,
Exactly.
that's basically how
If
it would
someone,
work.
if you went to a class that taught you how to do flipped classrooms, it would tell you to do the things. And hey, don't hear us wrong, folks. I'm sorry, like, listener, don't hear us wrong, right? I can't say he followed an exact procedure, but like,
Yeah.
he had to build the relationships. Key. He had to build content outside of the class. Key. He had to make it engaging. He had to improve it. Key. You know, he had to figure out how to do assessments now. Key, like these key points, right? He did all of them. I can't say it was the perfect linear progression, you know, or not. Please.
Yeah.
Steve's awesome. He's not perfect. He's close. He's close. He's close to
Yeah.
perfect, but he's not quite perfect.
I mean,
but,
yeah, he basically got all the keyblades from Kingdom Hearts and did a flipped classroom.
Yeah.
Like, that's what happened here.
Yes. I love this episode. This is like,
Yeah.
we've nerded out so much. I love it.
It's great though. The
Now I want
piece
to play
of
Kingdom Hearts. Thanks.
yeah, it's been a while, you know. The thing that I love about really what Steve was doing is just and highlighted so well is that to do flipped classroom, when you do it, it does open up a lot of opportunities in the classroom to do other things that we know foster learning, right? And we're not saying flipped classroom is the only way to do things. Like, I do want to highlight there is always a movement in education against any kind of like rogue speaking or lecturing and things like that. And
Right.
and I absolutely agree that should not be the only thing we're doing. There are some people who are like incredibly gifted in that, and I would listen to them talk for hours and actually learn what they do. And if that's their gifting as a teacher doing that, they can lean into parts of that. Don't only do that, because we know learning science says that no matter how great you are at it, that's not only how people learn, especially different topics. But what I love about what Steve's identifying is like, that's just not the way he does things, and instead finds a different way through flipped classroom to transform the way he's working with his students and build better relationships with them.
Yeah.
And that's where I would encourage, I think, a lot of teachers, no matter where you're at in K-12 or higher ed, to consider the same type of methods, or to consider start doing it. Like, a couple key things I want to highlight that Steve did well when he was jumping in that we didn't get too deep in. So I'm going to get a little meta here for a second, right? First, Steve went very simple teaching method, right? So the book that's titled
Small Teaching by James
Small
Lang?
Teaching. There we go. There's another book titled Simple something that I always screw up. So Small Teaching. I lean into that very heavily because it's all about picking something, taking small ideas and implementing them, right? And so now Steve didn't do that entirely, right? Because he was recording a whole crazy about a bunch of videos, but he didn't do the videos. They weren't like perfect videos. They weren't the most amazing videos. He will admit that in the beginning. He picked a class. He went with that class. He did the best he could in that moment and implemented some flipped classroom principles. And through that, learned different ways he could improve, ways he could change. And he's also getting feedback from students during doing this the entire time. Like, those are important ways to start the flipped classroom model. Like, I would encourage anybody listening to this, you don't necessarily have to be like Steve and immediately do the whole class or one whole class. Think about even just doing it with a period, like a week or a class
project.
meeting you're going to do, or a project, like, and see how that works. Because you can see in Steve's instance, he got to have so much more interaction with students. And I think there's such power to freeing up that space to be more of a place for students to try things, interact with ideas, think about something they learned through the video in different ways. There's just a lot of great stuff that Steve, I think, highlighted in the way that you can use a flipped classroom to really help your students engage and think carefully about what you're teaching or trying to get them to learn.
Yeah. I think the episode was near perfect. We gave a little bit of the preview, maybe a little too much preview this time, but I really hope that folks, you take to heart the fact that I believe Steve's wow. You know,
that?
When you're in a podcast and you just lose
Is that
your
like
brain and
busy
lose your
ethics?
mouth.
Is that?
Let me do some vocal warm-ups real quick. No. Steve's biggest tool was his heart. I don't want to be cliche, but he wanted to reach his students. he had past experiences like with drumline, with things like that, where he had those good relationships with the learners, and so he knew what it was like to have that, and he could acknowledge where a technique like the flipped classroom would help him get there. But
Yeah.
at the core of it, he wanted to reach his students. He wanted to teach them better. And I'm just flying high from that. It's always cool to hang out with somebody who's so mission driven and hear good technique, good ideas, good methods, a good tool like Cami, right? Like, it's great to have all that too, but to me, Steve's biggest win is where he started from. He knew he needed to have those relationships. He knew he had to reach the students. And then, I mean, I don't know if it's just some communism. Okay, that's a reference to Ted Lasso, folks. But I don't know if it's what's happening to me. But I'm just like, man, the fact that he could acknowledge he didn't need to be that sage on the stage reference, but he didn't have to be this authority figure. He wanted to be a group leader. He built a relationship with the students where they saw him as a participant in the learning ecosystem. And it just started like that. That's just one of many things in this episode that checked the boxes for me on my philosophy of education. I think that education is a collaborative process, a cooperative process. And the fact that he was willing to acknowledge that, embrace that, and be a part of the learning process with the students. We recently had Sharon Laricella on, Dr. Batgirl. That was an episode a couple episodes back for us, right? Yeah. Just making sure it wasn't in front of this episode.
I was just gonna roll with it. I was like, I'm pretty sure that's when we did that episode.
She said, though, in hers, she does all of her assignments. That is another practice here of people who are engaged in the learning with the students, not just separate, not this significant authority of I will teach you, but here's how we will learn. That, I mean, yes, thank you, Steve, for the flipped classroom techniques and methods and your experiences, and I'm so glad it was a positive one. But that message of being a part of the learning process with your learners, just check the box for me. That's it. It's a yes. It's a yes from me, says William Illingworth, Mark Cuban. I don't know.
and I didn't know you were on Shark Tank.
Just stop me.
HiTech Shark Tank. Here we go. Josh and Will will give you $2 to get your company up and running.
Don't say that. Don't say that.
Yeah, well, only one company. It's a whole thing. It will be a different podcast. Yeah, anyway, it's going downhill at this point. So what's coming next week? Well, Steve is coming back up. No, I'm just joking. Next week we do have another guest, a little cross pollination podcasting
education podcast network friend.
Yeah, exactly. That was a weird pattern that you did. I thought for a second there was like a commercial that's very similar to that, and I thought you were going into that vibe. Yeah, for those who don't know, we are a part of an education podcast network, which you should definitely go check out at edupodcastnetwork.com. I didn't have that up ready for this at all. I don't know what you're talking about.
At the beginning of every single one of our episodes, you hear from one of the other speakers on the network.
It's like you got a little reminder, but in case you skipped over that, shame on you. We're part of the network. Well, but Shiva Franklin is a host of the podcast Overthrowing Education, and she's also a part of the Education Podcast Network. We've been in meetings with her in the Education Podcast Network a few times. We've been talking with her a little bit. I've listened to her podcast a couple different times, which has some great content in it. I highly recommend going to check it out. But she is actually going to be joining us for the next episode to talk about training students to ask better questions through the lens of questioning paired with tech tools. If you're curious what that means, what that topic will look like, well, that's great. The episode's next week. So what are you doing? Wait for it to come out. Check out clips on YouTube before it comes out. That is going to be our next episode. Episode 114 will be that episode. A reminder again. Oh,
I messed up your notes there. It's Frankel, not Franklin, but we will be having a bunch of a Frankel.
Did I say Franklin?
Yeah, it's all good. I messed up notion. It's all good. Frankel, we're very excited to have you. Much of we can't wait.
Yes, I'm sorry. At least I got the most important and cool part of her name correct. So it's mainly because every time we talk about you, if you're listening to this episode, we only refer to you by your first name because it's too cool. So Speaking of somebody who would take a lot of Hebrew, I highly appreciate it. So anyway, that is our next episode. Just as a reminder to find us online at Twitter, YouTube, or basically any other social network at this point. Will has been expanding us.
I need to. We'll figure that out. So
check that.
Here's a 50-50, folks.
I'm going
We're
off
on
the script,
things.
so I'm putting Will on the spot.
We're either at HiTech Podcast, or some things we are at HiTech Pod, because some other podcast out there that's not operating, doesn't even have an episode, pinched our username. So it's fine. I'm not salty. It's fine. But Twitter and YouTube at HiTech Podcast, Instagram, Threads at HiTech Pod, Reddit at HiTech Podcast.
Yeah.
So there's a couple different ones that are happening.
Don't worry,
we will get a better list.
We will be updating our website and all our stuff here soon with other social media handles for us and find us. But two main places still, Twitter and YouTube. You can find us at HiTech Podcast. Please, if you have not followed us there or subscribed to us, especially if you've not subscribed to us on YouTube, what are you doing? Go over there.
Subscribe.
You know, if
Click
you
the
don't know
bell.
where YouTube is,
Like
it's
us.
youtube.com. Fun fact.
Let me Google that for you.
The original creator of YouTube went to high school, to my wife's high school. So that's fun.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
I didn't know
You
that.
didn't know that? Okay. Well, that's a different topic for a different time. But yes, find us on YouTube, subscribe. You can also email us, inbox at hitechpod.us. And a reminder, our website is hitechpod.us. All of our episode pages are there with information about the apps and the people that are on our podcast. You will definitely want to check that out. We also have a ton of other resources and some other new stuff coming there that you'll want to check out. So make sure to check us out at our website as well. Thank you again for joining us for another week as we continue to learn what it looks like to harness technology in the classroom, whether normal, flipped, upside down, backwards, all over the place, whatever you want.
Reverse.
Topsy-turvy, I don't know, online or in person. See ya.
See ya.